This video is about auditing, and auditing is the first step in the fleet management engagement process. Um, we'll focus on the Netaphor SiteAudit tools for that, and we'll begin by looking at a little bit about SiteAudit. There's on-site, and there's the hosted, as well as a third product called Compact. All three products do auditing. On-site is an on-premise tool. Hosted and Compact are both cloud products. But in 2020, these products won the Buyers Lab Best Audit and Fleet Management Tool. It's the third time that they've won this award, and there's lots of good things to say about that. Netaphor was founded in 1997. We've been in business now for 23 years. We focus on the print market, and in particular the solutions that are required to manage printing devices, and also now label makers and document scanners. So we make these tools, and our partners are trained, and they go out and do audits and manage fleets. We sell through only partners. A good deal of our sales come from overseas, approximately 60% in Europe, 40% in the US and Latin America. Some customers. So why run an audit? There's three basic reasons. What you want to do is you want to find out what's out there. So you want to do a discovery, and that discovery should tell you things like, what devices you have out there, how they're being used. And at the same time, you want to also identify what goals you have for your fleet. Typically, the reason why you would want to start an audit is that you might have some organization change, or you've never done an audit in your organization, or you haven't done one in recent time. So you want to do an audit in order to begin that discovery and find out what you've got out there. And that audit could include both interviews for people who use these devices, as well as information about those devices. So you begin the discovery process, and then, once you've discovered and collected a bunch of information about these devices, you want to make sure that you do some analysis on that. And in that analysis, you want to be able to determine what are the objectives for your fleet. For example, how much color printing should you be doing? How close should devices be to their users? What are the problems with supporting these devices, and how quickly can you resolve issues and things like that? So that's really the second reason. And then third most important thing is you want to know what it costs to run your fleet, and to make changes in that, to make it more efficient, to provide more visibility into what you've got out there and accountability. Then you want to have some sort of plan for that. And that's what the audit should result in. So what does the audit cover? What does it provide? There's really 5 basic things. One is it'll look at what you've got out there for the fleet. What are the mix you have between make and model, as well as how many, say, single function devices you have, multifunction devices. In the case of site audit, you can also find out how many wide format devices and label makers devices and document scanners as well. So you've got a full range of devices that are used for the printing and document process, and you can go and find what's out there, including locally attached devices as well. And once you've got that information, you also want to be able to determine if there are any problems with those devices. And so you want to do a fleet health analysis. What are the major problems out there, and then what are the resolutions to those problems, whether it be in terms of alerting, reporting. The basic idea is that when you do a fleet health analysis, you're targeting a way to improve the service performance of your fleet. When we look at supplies, we're looking at really the replenishment process. how fast can supplies be replenished? Because if they don't get replenished, if they go to empty, then you can't use the device anymore. So the program that supports that is usually what you want to look at, and that'll also add to your efficiency. And then if we look at volume, we're looking at what types of output are you generating as an organization, how much of it is color, how much of it is black and white, how much scanning are you doing, how much printing, copying, etc. And then you want to also determine how those devices are being utilized. Are they utilized to their maximum capacity, or as in the case most times, they're underutilized? You want to identify those and then maybe reposition them so they get better use. Then we will look at cost. What are the hard costs and soft costs? Hard costs are the actual things that you pay out in order to use devices. Soft costs has to do with productivity. If devices are always down and need repair, then you have lower productivity. And so SiteAudit does the tracking and reports that. You can see some examples of the dashboards we provide in our audit assessment. Now, adding to that is the green report. So many companies are also interested in sustainability programs. They have an initiative, or they just feel that it's their obligation to be able to understand what the carbon footprint these devices are producing, and what mitigation might be necessary in order to get to a carbon neutral environment. So green is another thing that we can track and provide information on. And lastly, security. Security looks at vulnerabilities. What are the open ports and communication issues that create risks for your organization? How can you close those? What should you close in order to make your environment more secure? So that's what an audit can cover. So now let's look at how these audits are performed. Um, it depends on what your again what your goals are. Um, all audits are performed by professional trained people who know how to look at data, do analysis, and come up with recommendations. If you're in a smaller environment, say less than 250 printers, you may be interested in just a general snapshot. So you want to know what inventory you have, what's the mix of the inventory, how many HPs, Canons, etc. do you have, how many are local printer, how many are network attached. So those things can be done in a snapshot. So you get the inventory and you get a sense for what your volume is. These are the least costly ways of producing an audit, and it's typically done in what's called a snapshot fashion. You take one snapshot time one, another snapshot time two, and then you take the differences. You can find out what's in your environment. A much fuller and richer type of audit is called a full audit. It runs for a longer period of time, and that does enough data collection in order to do a deeper analysis. You can develop some trends. You can look at things like fleet health. You can see how supplies are impacted by the replenishment program you have in place. It's just more thorough type of audit and examination. Um, this requires an installation of either an on-premise solution, or for acceptable to use a cloud solution, you can also install a DCA, data collecting agent. And that analysis typically runs, the data collection is 60 days and the analysis follows, and shortly after that um, you'll have your results. Typically this is for an environment with less than, say, 2,000 devices, could be more. It's not a big enterprise. Larger deployments, enterprise level, would probably more be suitable to use a full extended audit. There you've got 3 to 4 months of information to look at. Um, it does a much deeper analysis in terms of issues that are affecting the overall efficiency of the fleet, which you find sometimes in the shorter periods, say the snapshot, in some cases even the full, is that some devices may be turned off for a period of time. Um, And so you have the extended period with the full uh, extended audit that allow for things of that nature. So those are three different types of time periods and levels of analysis. The way the audit is performed is that there's some sort of um, installation. In the case of the snapshot, there really isn't an installation. You just download what's called compact and you run it. Nothing actually gets installed. But for the other two, the full and the full extended, you're going in on site and you're going to install data collecting agent. You're going to run that for a period of time. You may, in fact, even do what's called a walkthrough. You'll take a floor mapping tool like the SiteAudit Visualizer, and you'll drag and drop devices to where they're physically located in order to add a placement analysis. So that's all typically done in the first phase, and that's again 30 to maybe even 120 days. That's that data collection period. Then what follows is the analysis and reporting, and that's when the audit expert takes all that information, looks at it, does the analysis in the areas we talked about, then generates the reports and recommendations. Then we get to the third phase, and then that's the presentation to the end customer, and there are the recommendations about how to make the fleet more efficient, how to optimize. Maybe you're making some suggestions about removing, adding devices, introducing some programs. All that's done at that third phase. Now let's take a look at an actual audit case. This case has to do with, we'll call it Würzburg Instruments. It's not the actual name of the audit, but it's pretty close. So Würzburg has 800 employees. They're a manufacturing company of measurement equipment. And when the audit was started, they had 201 devices. And so you look at that, it's approximately a 4-to-1 ratio. It's 4 employees to 1 printer. And in general, that's an indication that there is no really fleet management that's looking at um, um, the optimization of the fleet. You should be looking at more of a ratio between 6 to 10 employees per device. Generally, that's a range where you can find more efficiencies and enough coverage for any kind of printing requirements. In this case, what they were interested in is 3 things. One is that they wanted to get a better control over their cost. So they wanted to do an analysis and see what things were costing, and then get some proposals that would reduce that cost. They also wanted to try to figure out what was the right number of devices, the right type of devices, and the right process that they need to have in order to sort of optimize their whole process. So right sizing was a big thing. And the third thing was that they wanted to have some visibility on what's going on, some oversight really. And for that, they wanted to have some accountability on a periodic basis in terms of what things are costing, how they're meeting their objectives, etc. So those are 3 objectives that Würzburg had. Now let's take a look at some of the audit results. If we look at the inventory, this is a dashboard view from SiteAudit of the inventory. What we can see is they started with 201 devices. A high percentage of those devices were over 5 years, so they had a fairly old fleet. The majority of the fleet was comprised of color devices over a cross section of 7 different manufacturers. So if you were trying to control cost, having to deal with 7 different manufacturers or 7 different types of products from 7 different manufacturers, it's a lot more support costs, a lot more administration costs when you have that many manufacturers. So that's definitely something that you want to take a look at. Then if we looked at the composition of the fleet, this wasn't so bad. Large percentage were Xerox devices, or they're probably old devices. And then there was a good substantial portion was Hewlett Packard. Most of those happened to be single function devices, and the as an box for multifunction devices. They did have some label makers. As I said, SiteAudit will discover label makers, and to a certain extent will track those, and they also had some wide format devices as well. So what you're left with is they have an older color device fleet. Now let's take a look at how they're using the device. Roughly, they do about 2 million pages annually. So you're at 250,000 pages per month, or less than that, 200,000 pages a month. And then of those devices, had a very low utilization rate. So if you look at utilization, what you're looking at is the manufacturer recommends a certain number of pages per month. It's sort of a low and a minimum of what this device can support. And the manufacturer also has typically a high rating as well, measured in pages, where if you went beyond that, you might damage the device. So where you'd want to be is someplace between the low and the high. And in this case, 98% of the fleet was under what the manufacturer recommended on a monthly basis. So it was a fleet that had a lot more capacity than was being used, a lot more printers than it probably needed. And then the other thing is that most of the output was going through the multifunction devices, meaning that they had some single function devices, but they probably didn't get used as much. And then lastly, the duplex duplex capability is pretty common in most devices. They underutilized it. Typically, we want to see a duplex rate of anywhere from 20 to 40% of all output. And if you use duplex more, then you'll be saving both on paper and on cost. So it's important to use duplex. Now, what's really interesting about this output is that over 60% was black and white. So you had a high percentage of color devices, but most of the printing was black and white. So you wondered, why did they have a lot of color devices? Good question. Another thing is they only did 8% of their output as copy. So most of their printing was black and white print, but yet they had a fleet that was capable of a lot more. They could have done a lot more copying, a lot more color, but for their requirements, they just needed black and white print for most of their applications. Now we look at supplies, sort of the third area in that fleet analysis. Most of the supplies happen to be below 25%. What that means is that the levels of the supplies and all the devices, the majority of those supplies were under 25%. And generally that points to the fact that these devices are not managed, because when you have such a high percentage, what usually ends up is a lot of those devices do get to zero and they're not replaced. So you probably have a large percentage of devices out there that have no supply in it, or maybe missing. Say they have a 4-color device and maybe cyan maybe is zero and black is some other color. They may have a couple of supplies that make it inoperable to use the device. So no one's checking the supplies, basically. The waste, meaning that what's left in the cartridge when it is replaced, on average, is pretty high, 7% across all supplies that are taken out and replaced. That can add up to some real money. And thirdly, we looked at how often do cartridges get replaced. And on a 20-day month, work month, 3 to 4 cartridges have to be replaced per day. So someone's got to learn how to do that, and so that may be another reason why so many devices are just sitting there not being used. Take a little bit more closer look at the waste cost, and want to see what are the possibilities in terms of savings there. What SiteAudit can show you is a what-if scenario. So if you were to manage those supplies but much better, So the average went from 7% down to 1%. In other words, you had some process in place that allowed someone to know when it was time to replace a supply. That potential savings is around $25,000 per year. So it's a bit of money by having a managed supplies program. If we look at fleet health, fleet health generally looks at where are the problems in the fleet. Uh, what can you do in order to uh, reduce the time it takes to respond to problems, usually a critical problem like a paper jam or out of paper. Um, those things may stop the device from performing, printing, copying, whatever. So you need to have a response mechanism to bring those devices back up. And so just looking at one particular model, there are several devices they had that were the 7830s. They had a paper jam issue. And then we took a closer look at that, and we saw that the frequency of paper jams, and in one particular place, Plano, Texas, where they had a lot of these Xerox devices that they were just left without any kind of service response. So the way you want to rectify that is that you want to set up alerts. And so if there is a paper jam, that either a local administrator or someone from the help desk can come and fix that problem. But this just shows you sort of the level of analysis you can do with SiteAudit. Just has to do with error conditions and fleet health, those kind of things. Now let's take a look at the results. So what we found is that over a 3-year period, if they were to implement some things, that they could save nearly a $500,000 on their fleet of what was presently 200 devices. What the recommendations were, and actually the steps that they did follow, was they reduced the fleet by 20%, and then actually they're going to reduce a little bit more afterwards. And then they removed some old devices. They added some black and white devices because most of their printing was black and white is less expensive than color. They went with an outsourcing program for their supplies management. They set up some alerts, and then for the visibility, accountability, they set up quarterly reviews with the partner who was working with this company. So roughly, they got a pretty good return. You may not be able to see it here on the upper right corner. That's the presentation that SiteAudit produces for its audit. It's a PowerPoint, and in their results, there's a ROI slide, and their ROI was very high, like over 1,000% if they followed all the recommendations. So now let's move to one other type of audit. We're going to look quickly at a security audit, and a security audit may run in conjunction with the general audit, or it may be maybe a separate audit. Thing about security audits that differs from general audits is that typically there's a workflow process with a security audit. In other words, you're going to see what the vulnerabilities are, you're going to make some corrections, and then you're going to do another audit in some period of time to make sure those corrections have resulted in some improvements. One other thing I can tell you about SiteAudit is that it has the ability to notify on security issues, so that when you get into fleet management, you can get alerted when these security vulnerabilities happen, and that's why it's part of the workflow process for security management. We call it an audit. Typically, it should be done in the beginning, but you can continue to do the security audit all through the fleet management process. So this is a finance company, fairly small company out in the New York area. They only had 27 devices, but their main concern was security. They wanted to protect all the devices from a couple things. They did not want their devices to be hacked, obviously, and they did not want their devices to be taken control over. So if it happened to be hacked, then it might be result in a denial of service or something that prevented people from being able to print. So they ran the security audit, and the security audit does two things. It identifies what are the open ports that are vulnerable. And typically those are the port 21, which is the FTP port, and port 23, which is the telnet port. And also looks at unsecure communications, which is the communication between the application and the device. Most cases that's done over SMP version 1 and clear text with no strong community string. And so you can easily improve that by using a non-standard complex password. So we'll take a look at that. So they did go and so part of the audit is what they do is they identify which devices have the open ports and lower, less secure SMP implementations. And what happens is that you get a spreadsheet and it shows you which devices have the open port threats and the locations, etc. And you simply go out and you implement the port closures on those. In some cases, you use different ports. So for like FTP, you can use like WebDAV is another one that's commonly used. So you close that port and use a different protocol. Then in some cases, in terms of the communication side, they move from version 1 to version 3. And so in this case, what happened is before they ran the audit, the results showed it that they had a security rating of what's called 1.1. So the rating looks at the amount of devices with open ports and looks at the SMP implementation, and there's a weighting based upon the usage of the devices. And in the initial audit, they had a fairly low rating, rated as weak. And then after they went out and did some changes, they improved things. They ran it a second time. I think it was around 60 days later, and closing those ports and improving the SMP version, they were able to increase the rating from 1.1 to 6.4, and that's a good rating in our vulnerability analysis. So they were able to, with really a minimal amount of effort, to reduce their risk. So that's a basic idea on how you might use the security tool for that. Lastly, I want to mention that auditing is really the first step into the fleet management process, and the fleet management has a lot more involved with it. So you might, for example, be interested in move, add, change, where devices move to, when they're added, when they're removed. That can be added in the fleet management process. The audit should help you get to the fleet management stage where you manage all your devices in a very cost-effective manner. You may want to actually do some further integration with SiteAudit data into your help desk system. And SiteAudit has a ServiceNow connector. So if you wanted to have your information go in right into the help desk, then that's a common implementation that we do. If you have a sustainability program, then you can also use that sort of in the workflow process like we talked about with the security audit. That can also be a reoccurring type of analysis where we look at the carbon footprint, your mitigation, and how that's improved over time. So that's the auditing information from Netaphor, and please contact us if you'd like to know more about our auditing tools.